It's Wizards versus Lesbians, a podcast for your ears. Hello, and welcome to Wizards versus Lesbians. My name is Isaac.
I'm Alexis.
And today we are discussing the first two volumes of the Lyremouth Chronicles by Jane Fletcher. Would you like to do the plot, or shall I?
I can give it a try. So Tevi is an incredibly strong young woman on an island where all the women are strong, are much, much, much stronger than the men. And so it basically has your classic gender roles reversed. And she is exiled for being gay. And she finds herself in a world she finds herself on the mainland with magic, and has a variety of adventures, including meeting Gemeril, a sorceress grad student who decides to help, who is ordered to help Tevi with her quest, and they very rapidly fall in love.
Yes. My take on it would be Tevi is born into a swords and sorcery novel.
Yes.
And we think that it's going to be a gender-swapped swords and sorcery story, but then it turns out that the swords and sorcery portion of this world is just some islands offshore from bisexual utopia, which is where most of the book is set.
Not quite utopia, but yes.
It has utopian qualities, which I think we will discuss more along those lines as we go. Why should you read this book? Oh, well, hang on. Lesbians, obviously, from the précis.
And wizards. And they fight.
Yes. We should decide what we're going to call lesbians who are also wizards. I was thinking about this last night, and I think it's wisbians. I think it is wisbians rather than lizards, yes.
Yeah. Lizards are just those, lizards that reproduce parthenogenically.
Yes, indeed. Although this is, again, a default bisexual society, so Tevi is the only gay woman in the entire world.
Yes, she is.
But she is definitely a lesbian.
Yes.
This causes problems for her. So,
Yes.
Why should you read this book?
I found it to be charming and silly and fun.
I think it's, not only do I think it's charming and silly and fun, but I think it's actually got some interesting stuff going on, and
it does, it's true.
A lot of prescient stuff. This is a retro episode. These books came out in 2002-ish.
Which makes them over 20 years old, which is kind of horrifying.
I'll let you process that. It's all new to me. And I think that it actually sets out some sort of ideas about technocracy that have really borne fruit over the last couple of decades. And so I want to give the book its credit for being very sort of far-sighted in certain ways.
Yeah, which, I'm not sure that it was so much the author trying to project as there's a level of detail to this world building that did not have to be here. The world is this world and its society and the themes are remarkably thought through for what is mostly just, a charming romantic, charming fantasy romance. Mm-hmm. Adventure.
I would also say that this book reminded me the most of anything we've done of the Steerswoman books. So if you want Steerswoman with actual, you don't have to reach for it, lesbians.
And actual wizards, though I suppose that's a spoiler for the Steerswoman books.
The setting is quite Steerswoman-esque in many ways.
I think in that they're both inspired by swords and sorcery settings.
Yeah, and also the tone and, grappling with, the gifted versus the commoners and leaders as, shills and manipulators and that kind of stuff. And grappling with technocracy and its consequences, it's as though half the world was run by the Steerswomen. And maybe that would be great in some ways and less great in others. And it might not be, as captivating plot-wise as the Steerswoman books. But,
these books are smarter than they need to be. They are not as smart as the Steerswoman books.
Yes, but still, if you're pining for some of that flavor, you could probably get some from these books. Why shouldn't you read it?
I think that probably I think that you shouldn't go into this with your expectations too high. It is, It's kind of janky. It's a small press book. The quality of the physical editions isn't very good. Um, some of the stuff is a little. Some of the stuff, despite it being thought through, the implications don't quite work. Like, I don't. I'm not a fan of stories where some people are just inherently gifted, and other people have zero talent whatsoever, and those people are the majority. Because I don't think that works. Because, like, in this book, as in most of these books, it's a metaphor for either intelligence or like artistic talent or creativity, and that's not how basically any human ability works. So it doesn't work. I don't like it as a metaphor for what it says about society. These books kind of turn that on itself by really digging into what that would mean for society. So I like that, but it can still be it can still get a little tropey sometimes.
I agree. I think that it is one of those books where it's like, okay, if you accept that this is true, what does that imply? And and on the one hand, you can dismiss the book for positing that this untrue thing is true, but on the other hand, it does act as a pretty good sort of insight and deconstruction of what the world is like when it is designed by people who think that's true, which unfortunately is our world in some places. So
yeah, and it's not a matter of this untrue thing is true. It's a matter of the underlying metaphor is saying something that I think is untrue, damaging to our view of other people, and also not particularly interesting.
I agree with you on the first two fronts, but because of the way the book handles it,
Not this book. I'm talking about the trope in general.
Oh, of course, the trope in general, absolutely.
I think that the way this book handles it is actually quite interesting, and even the third and fourth books actually continue to dig into that in interesting ways. I also actually do want to hand it to this book for making magic explicitly non-hereditary, so most people with magical talent don't have magical children, which is one of the ways that it really sort of plays with and deconstructs the usual magic as special as gifted child.
I would say that, and as far as other reasons not to read this book, if you're really invested in having like a 3-act structure from your stories,
the pacing is all over the place.
Yeah, no, I would describe the pacing of this one as picaresque. The picaresque adventures of Tevi and Jimril. I guess they're not particularly roguish, but a series of events do take place. If you accept that, then it's good for us because it's like, oh, this is doing something different, therefore it's more interesting. But,
right. But it's the pacing is all over the place, and among other, the start is way too slow. The start could have been this really could have been a book, and with like the first third of the first book drastically pruned.
And that's particularly a problem because the part of the thing the book does is like, oh, you think you're in this really boring metaphor and setup? I'm going to whip the curtain away, and you're going to be in a more interesting and like complex setup. But if I hadn't been reading it for this book, I'd have been like, oh, okay, and stop reading it before we get to that point. So, that is kind of a problem.
Right.
Also,
I bought this book at the same time about 10 years ago that I bought Daughters of a Cruel Dawn, when I was going through and reading all the old lesbian science fiction fantasy books. Right before, it took off in the zeitgeist.
Mm-hmm. Also, the ebook formatting is, I don't know, you said that the print books were bad. The ebook formatting, particularly in the second book, is atrocious. Like, no care was taken. So there is that.
That's unfortunate.
That leads us to content warnings, though, I think.
Yeah, I know that, content warning homophobia is, I feel, a little bit eye-rolly, but I actually think that the early scene where Tevi gets outed by her family, when I first read it, it was genuinely stressful.
Yeah, that was a really, that's probably the most, harrowing scene in the whole book, and it does come again before the interesting part starts happening. So
right, and I mean it is a level of, it is a sufficiently realistic depiction of both abusive family and of being outed when you weren't ready, that I think it genuinely does rise to the level of a content warning.
I agree. Beyond that, we have mind control, suicide, uh, murder, gaslighting.
I could be wrong, but I don't think there's any sexual assault or even threatened sexual assault.
No, the mainland is very cool as far as that goes.
Yes. I guess there's one scene of, violence in response um, a being flirted with by somebody of the same sex. But
Yes, it's all a big misunderstanding, it turns out.
yes.
With that being said, shall we go on to discuss this book?
Yeah, let's go on to discuss this book.
A magpie is harmed in this book, if you care about that. It's around for most of the action, though, before it is squashed flat. Time for spoiler chat. So the reason that I called it Utopia, it's not so much a utopia as it is like a technocracy.
Yeah.
And there's a lot about the sort of, we have the kind of rule by academia.
It super is ruled by academia, including that, like, most people don't want any responsibility, and the people who do are kind of assholes.
Mm-hmm. But we also it's also sort of a rule by Silicon Valley priesthood.
Yes.
Or, in a way that wouldn't have been obvious when the book was written, but it does match up, like, startlingly well as it goes on.
Yeah, it's the
sort of fear and disgust for the normies on the part of our villainous sorceress. Her quest for immortality, of course, currently a classic in the Peter Thiel community, which I guess I'll just call it. And
the quest for immortality, and then when asked, well, but what about everybody else? How are you going to handle society where everybody has immortality? Being like, well, obviously only the special people are going to be immortal, as, this belief that only the deserving should get immortality, and the deserving are the people with social power.
Yeah, our evil sorceress actually explains herself to, I think, a greater degree than any of these people that are currently seeking for this have been, pressed to, which is kind of funny.
Yes, well, she has, I think, a little bit more self-awareness.
Well, and she's also trying to talk herself out of being arrested.
Yes.
At the time. But I think that this book does a great job of exploring the tensions of even, like, I would say that, like, the Protectorate, I mean, it's just straight up called the Protectorate, which is red flag number one. But, like, the Protectorate is a pretty good place to live. It's probably the best place to live in this entire world.
It is absolutely the best place to live in this entire world. I mean, you get to see the points where they leave first of all, you see Tevi's home, and then you see the kingdom, the Empress's place that, they pass through when they're chasing the evil sorceress. And that's awful. The third book is set there, so you get to see just how awful it is.
Sure.
And everywhere that has, and I mean, that everywhere else, even if it's pretty good for like 30 or 40 years, when as soon as the wizard who's ruling it dies, you get a succession crisis because magic isn't hereditary.
Yes, exactly. It's the sort of, the metaphor is like, we're pivoting from it's not even pivoting. It's like, it's ruled by the gifted. The book is sort of compressing, like, the whole, what happens when Genghis Khan dies and his, none of his children are up to the task of keeping the empire together thing. In fact, that specifically is not compressed at all. The biggest empire that the world ever saw until the British Empire was for the lifespan of one guy. So, this is drawn from history. But sort of the point that the book is trying to make, okay, so, we're going to examine what happens when there's a sort of a rule by council, because democracy was always a pipe dream, I guess, in the sort of the setup of this book. Uh, ruled by sort of a council of the wise who, are sort of act as a parliament in certain ways. And this leads to the best possible government in this world system, but the people still aren't super happy about it, which I thought was a good, observation. There's still a lot of resentment and lack of trust. People don't really understand how good they have it.
Yes, and and like people on the outside are resistant to being annexed. Partly because they can benefit from having close proximity to the protectorate, but if the protectorate annexes them, then they have to pay taxes.
Yes, so it's sort of like, again, this is way more socio-politically complex than it needs to be, given the story that we're telling, which is mostly about hunting down a wicked sorceress. But I think that it's also sort of a really, the reason that I think that this take on this particular trope is interesting is because it's really interested both in how this doesn't lead to universal happiness, or even, like it's just the best of a bunch of bad options, basically.
Yeah.
But it's also really wants to examine the ways in which it can go wrong. And the more that we get to see inside the way that the government actually works, the more like, oh, this is actually full of fools and bigots and, climbers and the, really good people who are being discriminated against for stupid reasons, and, so on and so on and so on. And the whole thing just sort of lurches along anyway, which is probably the most realistic thing about, a sort of non-authoritarian government.
Right. And, I really, the whole rule by academia, you get to see a lot of the same dysfunction, which is what happens when people's qualification for leadership is mostly their based on their scholarship qualifications.
Right, exactly. But it's sort of like if you want, this is another book where it's like we're trying to peel back the metaphor of what magic is, which again is where it sort of breaks down. In this world, the magic system is being able to see and interact with the fifth, sixth, and seventh dimensions, which are like life, auras, physics, and time.
Yeah.
And the sort of the life aura thing is sort of a metaphor for being a medical professional. The physics aura thing is obviously sort of a metaphor for being a physicist. And, the time thing is mostly a plot device.
I'd say being a physical scientist.
Yeah. I'll get back to why I explain this later. It's mostly about disability. I really, we have a return to a trope that we haven't seen in Wizles for a while, which is the, our two lesbians are really, really committed to each other and really good for each other, but they're also like really struggling with their class differences.
Yeah. So that's the fun thing about these books is that, because we've talked about this before, that, with a lot of these books, they want to have a society that is at least utopian when it comes to having no homophobia. And, these books really kind of predate trans people being, part of mainstream. But you've definitely got the idea that gender is kind of meaningless. This is why it takes her so long to even figure out that Tevi could be a lesbian, because the idea that somebody's into only one preference is even weirder than being like, oh, I'm only attracted to redheads. And, so, okay, but then how do you then have your thing that's keeping them apart to tell your queer love story if your society doesn't have any homophobia? And so this is why we generally introduced all of these artificial, these stories. Sometimes it's culture, sometimes it's class, like it is in this one. Sometimes it's, the necro cavalier thing. Right. You have to introduce a different binary that they have to transgress. Except this book wants to do that. This book wants to have its homophobia-free society, and it wants to have its queer romance that has to defy convention, be queer also in the sense that it's defying convention. But it also wants to be a traumatic coming out narrative, which is how you get Tevi being the only lesbian in all the world.
It's once again, like, this is, I mean, this is another one of our special little guys. I think I can say
yes.
that.
Yes. Yeah. No. These books have been my special little guys for a while. So.
Yeah. No. It's really trying to do too much, and if it doesn't always hold together, what was one expecting? If you go into it with a generous spirit, like, I think it gets a lot of interesting stuff while it's cramming this all in.
Yes, and to be, it is fairly consistently entertaining, at least.
Which helps, yes. And also the jokes are actually funny, which is not something that we can take for granted. This setup, which takes way too long to set up and is kind of cumbersome in some ways, does also let us do really fun things, like with Tevi's internalized misandry to go along with Tevi's internalized homophobia. I think that, like, one of my favorite things was, like, this thread unfortunately sort of gets dropped and not picked up again, at least in these two books, but there's a scene really early on when she's looking wistfully at the brightly colored shirts that men in her women-run, barbarian society wear, and it's like, oh boy, what if I were to wear a brightly colored shirt? No,
right.
An almost transmasc narrative, which disappears when, like, there's no place for that to take hold on the main island, just because the concept of gender doesn't really, it's barely impinges on people's consciousness in a frankly unrealistic way.
Yes,
on the mainland.
Yeah, but okay, actually, so that's a really fun thing, though, is that Tevi, despite being the only lesbian in the world, Tevi's, like, homophobia coming out narrative is in many ways that of a gay boy, right?
Very much so. I mean, which matches the fact that the first part of this book is just
completely gender swapped
Conan the Barbarian with a gay Conan,
right?
Who turns out to have an incredibly, like, brick droppingly literal disability. She has tunnel vision.
Yes.
And then the book has the nerve to say, "Boy, this is kind of like your worldview, isn't it?" Yes. I saw what you were doing. I don't have tunnel vision, but
yes. Well, these books are not subtle.
Yeah,
but
anyway,
yes. Actually, and I do enjoy. But, like, this book just also it just piles the metaphors on, because it has both, like, she has her literal disability, which is tunnel vision, which gets cured by magical LASIK, basically.
yes.
But you also get your social model of disability thing, where she has this thing that she's really bad at sword fighting on her island, but as soon as you put her into a different social context, in this case, away from all of the iron that is blocking her very minor prescience ability, suddenly she has, like, 1 second of prescience, which makes her a really good sword fighter. All she needed was, a different context.
Yes, I'm sorry. We've totally got lost in a set of nested digressions there.
Yes,
but there's a lot to talk about in this book, and again, our format is fitting the story.
Yes.
So.
Right, but so anyway.
But what I was going to say was that in addition to the colorful shirt sort of trans possibility there, I also really enjoyed the gallant Herbo Tevi
yes.
when she's on the mainland, being incredibly gallant and solicitous toward all the men who are just very confused by this.
Yes, no, I think that Tevi is a sort of prototypical lesbian himbo, predating, say, Gideon, and paving the way for Gideon and Sorway and all the others.
And it's a character trope that I love, so I was happy to see it here.
No, and I enjoy that, like, people keep pulling her aside and being like, you've got to stop this. You're offending people. And it's not that she's offending their sense of masculinity. It's just that if you're an adult and someone's like, it must be so hard for you now that your mother has died to run a big business all by your little self. That's going to make anybody feel kind of uncomfortable and annoyed.
Yes. It's like I'm being condescended to and microaggressed, but along an axis that I don't even understand. Like, what is
Right,
even happening?
exactly.
Like, what is it about me that she's perceiving that is making her behave this way? I don't know.
Yes. And in some ways, also, Tevi's story, again, because we've just loaded Tevi with everything, except, and what's left over gets loaded onto Gemerald. But Tevi's story is also sort of, queer kid gets thrown out of the house for being gay and moves to the big city and, like, has to develop a gaydar.
Yeah.
I found the point where Gemerald has to, like, walk Tevi through all of these gay couples that she has met, that she has just either assumed she's misreading the genders, or she's, assumed that, oh, Big Papa and Little Papa, that must be a really cutesy way of saying dad and granddad.
Yeah, no, I really like, the overbearing tunnel vision metaphor aside, I really enjoyed the like, I feel like it's that they didn't overegg her level of, like, cheerful culture shock, obliviousness.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like this is totally a thing that people do, and that it is possible for people to do, is just, like, ignore every obvious sign around them because it conflicts with your particular complex.
Right.
And because you can't talk about the thing anyway, the fact that it's not actually a problem, or that it's completely different than you think it is just completely invisible to you.
Right.
And she suffers through this for, like, a long time. Like, more than a year, I think, of being in this culture.
Yes, and one part of the problem is, this is one of the problems with the pacing, is that it takes so long to get us to, because this has to be the thing that keeps her apart from the love interest, at least initially. Though I gotta give them credit; it only takes them about a chapter to work through that before Tevi is finally like, "No, I must tell you my shameful secret," and it takes, like, 3 explanations before Gemerald even understands that this is a thing. But
Yeah, I loved how General just sincerely had no idea what the fuck she was getting.
she's like, okay, sorry, walk me through this again.
Like, you've grown up in a society that has no concept of homophobia and barely has a concept of gender, and this alien is trying to tell you why it's a shame to be a lesbian. You don't even understand what a lesbian is, really.
And she's trying to apologize for being a lesbian,
Right.
and be like, I'm sorry, I can't travel with you because you're too attractive, and that is, sinful of me. And Gemerald's like, huh?
I don't even have the priors to approach this. Like, there's no Christianity or sin here anyway. So,
right, exactly. So, but points that they do talk it out. It's funny because often in books, right now I feel like a lot of the discourse, at least the smarter discourse, is about how too many characters these days explain their feelings exhaustively, and everybody talks like they've all gone to see a good therapist, and you don't have any interesting conflict because everybody's
Right.
so self-actualized. But this book really is sort of reminding you where some of that comes from, which is that the generation of books before this one, the main way of developing conflict, interpersonal conflict, was to have 2 people be really stupid about something in a way that was just frustrating.
Yeah, but I didn't even find it frustrating in this book because it's just so funny.
Right, no, but also it's funny, and also this book is coming after those books, and so it goes, okay, we're going to milk this for comedic potential, and then we're going to wrap it up and move on to another conflict. And then it moves on to conflicts that cannot be so easily processed, which is generally, how...
Which is the class conflict in this
right,
case.
Exactly.
How, Gemerald keeps talking down to all of the other normies and thinking that it's okay because she's not talking down to Tevi specifically, which is something that I'm sure that many people have, firsthand experience of if you've dated outside of your, in-group.
Right. It's, oh, well, sure, but you're hot.
Right, pretty much. You're one of the good ones. Like, you're actually smart, unlike everybody else like you who I see. And that kind of thing. Which is, it's really good because Gemerald, like, it's also realistic in that, unlike the homophobia thing, which is like, once they've figured it out, they figured it out. Jem does not learn her lesson immediately at all. Like, Jem really has a hard time, again, even understanding the sort of contours of the argument. And then, keeps fucking up along the same lines over and over again, even as we get like far into the second book, which I think is realistic.
Yeah, I mean, even um, from what I recall, like, she's getting slowly better at it with each book, but it's basically part of the fundamental conflict of their relationship is going to be that if it's also that for Gemerald, if she wants to have the kind of career that her talents and ambitions could lead her to, she's got to be in a place where there's lots of wizards, and anywhere where there's lots of wizards, everyone's going to look down on her for being involved with Tevi.
Yeah, exactly. And it's one of those actually intractable problems where you are in fact going to have to make some significant sacrifices to make this relationship work. And it's sort of her coming around to the idea that, oh, that's true, actually. And in fact, we may have to be like vagabond adventurers for the rest of our lives to live the kind of lifestyle we want to lead.
Yes, but one of the problems with this book is that Gemerald doesn't show up until like almost halfway through the first volume.
Yes, the Exile and the Sorcerer, the first book, the exile isn't exiled until a quarter of the way through, and the sorcerer doesn't show up until half of the way through. In fact, another sorcerer shows up just to, like, throw you off the scent before the sorcerer that we're interested in shows up.
Yes.
But, so yeah, no, the pacing can be a real issue.
Yes.
If we're So
speaking of pacing, we've basically spent this entire time talking about the first book.
Yeah, I actually think that the second book is also sort of a two books crammed together, or if the books should have been crammed together, then like maybe this would have been the meat of the first half. The second book might have been the meat of the story.
Yeah.
Which I think is probably the most. It's probably like the most sort of classic and most interesting part, because it's a mystery story. It's a whodunit. Gemerald basically has to infiltrate medical school in order to find out which of the faculty is the person who has stolen the forbidden spells. Yes. And lo and behold, it turns out to be the least pleasant one of them.
Right.
Which is always a bit of fun.
Actually, the second least pleasant one of them.
Yeah, I suppose so.
What's his face is pretty awful.
He's like the classic ineffectual, sort of managerial dude character, but like we have a particular problem with what's her? Do you remember what her name is?
No,
because I don't.
I forgot.
I'll put it in.
Okay.
But will I put it in? Will I? It's Levenue. We have a particular problem with her because our favorite person hates her, and our favorite person hates nobody except her.
Yes.
So, she's definitely the baddie. And normally in a mystery story, that would be the red herring, but not in this one. It's just the least pleasant person. She's the one who did it. And we're going to go on from there.
Yes.
But along the way, we get a lot of sort of, insights into like academic backbiting and stuff. And also it turns out that the reason that this whole feud that basically, touches off this entire story happened is because the one we like and the one we don't like were dating and then broke up, and just never date within your field is basically the lesson that we need to learn from that.
Right? No, I mean, like, this is the thing is that I did find this entire section to be a pretty good depiction. Like everything was simplified, but it was a reasonable depiction of academia. Like Gemerald sort of showing up as it's a little fuzzy. They sort of fuzzed the categories of undergrad, PhD student, and postdoc. But, whatever.
Oh, the author's English. It's different there anyway.
That's true. It's a different system. And in the UK, you can apparently just get a PhD by having written a bunch of stuff already, which I feel like is cheating. But anyway, but like it's a pretty good, it's a very good depiction of all of the backbiting and stupid, like really stupid drama, and the way that like different people's grad students start to take sides for no damn reason.
Mm-hmm. And Vine, of course, who's called Vine because of Grapevine, because it's her goal in life to know everybody's business at all times.
Yes.
And to
Levenue, that's her name.
Yes, that's the evil sorceress's name. And by evil sorceress, we mean a woman who thinks that we should not have forbidden looking into immortality.
Well, who specifically believes she should have access to immortality, and she is willing to commit a great deal of psychiatric abuse.
Yes, and murders.
And murders. And manslaughter to achieve this.
Mm-hmm. Sort of, she's a great horrible character. She's not like a psychopath. She still feels bad about what she's doing, but she's carefully weighed the pros and cons of becoming an immortal sorceress versus not becoming an immortal sorceress, and has concluded that killing a few people is probably fine in the pursuit of that goal, even though she still feels bad about it.
She works well as sort of a cautionary tale for Gemeril, who, there's the point where where they have Gemeril start being Levenue's assistant, and Gemeril's like, actually, this is good because I don't particularly like medical magic. I don't like having to be nice to people, and I do like getting really into research. And so, she and Levenue actually get along pretty well until she's, until they're trying to stop her from uncovering the power of immortality and also getting away with murder.
And it's even more one-to-one than that, because the whole thing that started this off was Levenue had a relationship with Niam, who turns out to be secretly not as gifted. She's like in the second tier. She's really good at medical, but can't do the physics.
Right, but she's so good at medical that people kind of just pretend she can do the physics, which is a really great example of the way that people will sort of retroactively decide, oh, you don't have a disability because you're competent enough in specific other things that we can just pretend you don't have this disability, which also happens a lot in academia.
So a gifted person and an ungifted person had a relationship, and it broke up possibly because of, or a less gifted, in quotes, person, a person who's been othered, and it broke up for reasons that we're not told. And this, and what are Jem and Tevi, if not a, sort of a tempestuous relationship between a gifted, ambitious person and a quote unquote not gifted and much less ambitious person who is more interested in human beings and their feelings. And so it's like, yes, I think that you're right, that this is meant to be a there but for the grace of God goes Jem sort of a situation.
Right, and that, if she had fallen for somebody who was, if her relationship with Tevi and also having to track down and defeat Levenue hadn't, made her confront all of this stuff, because after the first book, she is actively working on it. She's not super successful, but she's making a real effort not to be like all of the snobs around her.
I did really enjoy that. At no point is Jem even slightly persuaded by Levenue, by Levenue trying to sell immortality to her.
Right.
Even if Tevi hadn't been there being like, you're a monster, I don't think Jem would have been at all swayed by it. But maybe if Jem hadn't, had this time with Tevi to think about it, it wouldn't have gone that way.
Well, the thing is that I don't think that Jem is necessarily going to be tempted by immortality, because Jem is really, because Levenue is really invested in immortality. And maybe she was invested in other things before that, but that's the thing, that's her obsession. But the thing that Gemeril is really emotionally invested in is the Protectorate itself. She's really into the institution of the Protectorate in a way that most of the other wizards aren't even. She's really trying to sell Tevi on the every single time they pass some other place where something has gone wrong in a wizarding society. Gemeril will be like, and see, that's why we need the Protectorate.
It's so funny because it's such the two kinds of tech people. It's like, on the one hand, Levenue is saying, yes, of course, only the important people will get the immortality, drug. But the thing is that the thing that the important people do is objectively the most interesting and important thing that can be done in the world.
Right. And Gemeril is like, I agree with you that this is, the most interesting thing in the world. But I am a old-fashioned left-wing patriot, and
I'm an institutionalist, god damn it.
Right? No, it's like the difference, it's the difference between your Peter Thiel type and, your gives a ton of money to like center left Democratic candidates type.
Yes. The people who really believe in effective altruism, at least at first. But
I don't know about. I don't know. I think that among other things, I think there's some overlap between the effective altruism people and the immortality people. So
the first step in effective altruism is you shouldn't give money to people on the street because charitable organizations can help them on a systemic level, and you don't know what the individual will do with the money. The second step of effective altruism is noticing how these charities are pretty chaotically run, and you can never be sure where the money eventually goes, so you might as well make your own charities that'll distribute it right and put it in the right places. The third step of effective altruism is noticing that you have the best notion of where money should go, which means in the end, all the money in the world should eventually go to you so you can distribute it the most efficiently, which is a phase that lasts for the rest of your life. I should note that possibly the most utopian feature of this society is that A, it's run by unions, and B, there's a 100% inheritance tax.
Yes, which is great.
The Protectorate would not go down well with the tech people of 2024.
Right. Well, and actually, that's part of, it's this interesting thing because it really makes sense there's 100% inheritance tax because the Protectorate is run by sorcerers. And the thing about being a sorcerer in this society is that your children will basically never inherit your magical talent.
Right.
And so it's not surprising that they've set up a society where nobody else gets to inherit anything from their parents either.
Mm-hmm. Which it would be a way of creating an alternative power base also, so it's smart on their part.
Right.
So we haven't even mentioned how, Gemerald, the place that Gemerald starts out is that she's so bad at understanding people who aren't sorcerers that, she manages to bungle herself into people thinking that she's an evil sorceress who's gone mad and has shut herself away in a haunted castle surrounded by werebears just because she doesn't understand social cues.
Right.
Basically.
And yes, General is definitely a little bit autistic. But also, and to the point that she's like, oh, it doesn't matter. I don't need to talk to these people. I'll just set up a bunch of protective charms and then, hang out in my tower and do research and not have to talk to anybody. And it doesn't occur to her that if everybody thinks she's insane, they're not going to leave her protective charms in place.
Right. Also, sorceress, can meddle in the fifth and sixth dimension, but will not make a phone call.
Right, exactly.
Although that's actually a thing that annoys me about this book. Given the technology that they have, there should be a magical phone system, but it would be inconvenient for the plot if there was, so there isn't. Maybe none of these people like making phone calls.
Yeah, the thing is that they have... the thing is that the wizards can magically communicate, but...
they do have, that long-distance system, but they still had to send a messenger to Lyremouth manually in order to get. Well, maybe that's just because of a communication problem between the guilds and the sorcery. But anyway, it's inconsistent. But who cares?
Yeah.
Segue.
So I really like the little things at the end of each book. This is also in the third and fourth book of the folk tale that comes out of them.
Oh, yeah, no, I thought that was great. Thank you for mentioning that. I forgot to write that down because I was falling asleep as I finished it. No, those are great. I think that it's not only, a fun little exercise, but it's also a smart, sort of, well, this is how queer people get erased from history, who writes the folktales,
Right.
How are these, great heroic stories changed to fit the needs of the governing power of the place that exists.
Yes.
This actually dovetails with sort of a recurring theme of this book, which is I was going to bring this up earlier, but I got distracted. Magic may be, all of these academic disciplines, but really magic in this world is getting people to think how you want them to think. as we see with the sort of the outsider sorceress, but also, so much of what magic is on a practical level is the ability to convince people to go along with what you want. Leadership qualities, basically, in terms of how the society is actually functioning. And so, like, despite there being no magic on these islands, Tevi's grandmother is like a massive sorceress.
Yes, no, that's true.
And I think that the book is very interested in the way that, in the classic fantasy way, the way that stories allow people to maintain power, but also in that how, really a lot of the trick of being a leader is getting people to follow you. And brute force is one way to do that, but perhaps not the only or the most effective way.
Right, and you get to see sort of, and because they go to these different places, you get to see the place that's just on the edge of the protectorate and is sort of benefiting from it. It's the unincorporated county outside the big city. And,
Yes.
and you get to see the Tevi's home islands, and you get to see the Empress Baikoda's, like, horrible place, and the weird border town. And so, you do get to see all the different kinds of ways that you can have leadership and have a government, and some of them are more functional than others, but none of them are great. The other thing I like about the stories, so I like that actually in the third and fourth book they're the villains of their respective stories.
Oh, cool.
Right? So, like, it's not even that these are all heroic. And I like that they're the villains in the other two, because it really, I think it gets to what you're saying about how, this is how people get erased or not erased from history. And also, I like the stories because in some ways they're kind of a throwback to the sword and sorcery things that these books really descend from.
Absolutely. I mean, and frankly, fairy tales.
Yes, also fairy
tales.
tales.
There's a really fairy tale cadence to the story at the end of the second book, at least.
Oh yeah, no, especially actually the story at the end of the first book is a super fairy tale also, like with the, love can melt a hardened heart or whatever.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, no. Which is why I keep coming every time we get a fairy tale story. It's why I say this must be didactic, because what is this person trying to tell us with this fairy tale that they're writing? Because why else do you write a fairy tale? But the thing that struck me when I was reading this is yet another of the cool things that is crammed into these two actually relatively short books is that they have to sort of do an anthropological study. Like she has to do like academic research into sort of historical anthropology to figure out where Tevi's people came from in order to solve the mystery.
Yes.
And that includes reading the field notes of a guy who was living among the ancestors of Tevi's people, who were the patriarchal, barbarian tribe, before happenstance and a magic potion turned them into a matriarchal barbarian tribe when they got out to the islands. And one of the notes that this guy, this is meant to be like an academic from bisexual, no sexism world, going out to make field notes on these people and like extrapolating about the consequences of their culture, which is a great way to, do a little bit of sly social commentary, of course.
Yes.
And one of the things that he says was, well, under this system, genuine love must be almost impossible.
Right.
And I'm like, aha.
There's some classic old, second wave feminism.
Yeah, that's a funny little dig.
Yes. And also, I mean, I should point out for the listeners who've not read this, this is General going back and reading this history, this historical anthropology, so she can figure out what Tevi is talking about when Tevi is trying to explain that she's a lesbian.
She has to go to the library and do reading in order to understand the concept of sexism, because it's such like a historical oddity. And that without sexism, lesbianism doesn't exist if you don't, right,
that
exactly.
Everybody's just bisexual.
Once again, not sold on that.
Not sold on that, But I mean, to some degree, you know, again, these books are sort of a product of their time, and they're from they're from an era where there was less, where the people really trying to dig into, you know, publicly online from a variety of different perspectives, dig into what gender means to them, you know, was not really accessible.
And I think that, and you know, this is the viewpoint of like, if you hit this sort of, for lack of a better term, if you become woke to gender and you're like, well, okay, under this system, it must be extremely difficult for genuine relationships to exist between men and women because of all of the power imbalance and all the history and everything. Which, if you buy into it too much, leads you to radical feminism turf stuff.
Right.
But sort of, I think it reminded me of back when I started seeing, you know, the sort of the wave of lesbian characters appearing in webcomics, which is the first place that I experienced it.
Uh-huh.
It's like, whoa, why are all of these, you know, ongoing fantasy or science fiction or, you know, comic book stories that are mostly written by men or people who identified as men at the time, why are there suddenly all of these lesbians showing up? You know, there's been a sort of burp in the zeitgeist, and I don't understand it. And the way that I explained it to myself at the time was that, okay, these are people who were brought up by, you know, boomers mostly. These are people brought up by feminists in many cases, and who've been absorbing, you know, feminist ideas their entire lives, which is good. I just want to point that out there. I think that's, I don't want to completely erase the contributions of our foremothers, you know, to the current discourse. But they're also running into this problem. It's like, okay, how does love exist here? And like, even if I figured out a specific way to make it work in my life, how do I make it work in fiction without, like, you know, having to run up against all these problems of patriarchy and heteronormativity? But I want to write a love story. Lesbians.
Yeah, of course, half of these writers are now trans women, so...
Yeah. But they may have taken this on very personally into their lives and decided that the only way that they could personally experience love was to become a lesbian. But far be it from me to imply that. But
and honestly, there's another, you know, half of the remainder that I'm just counting down the days.
Yes, but it gave me, I wanted to mention that, you know, because it's a really interesting, you know, piece of history in this book, but also because it does, I think it is also like, if you want to understand how, you know, Ikuhara feels about lesbians, you know,
yeah.
or people who are interested in who, particularly in the late 90s, early 2000s, were writing gay stories without being, you know, out lesbians themselves, how it is sort of this trying as a person who has been assigned male to think your way out of the, you know, well, I'm inherently part of this evil patriarchal, you know, overclass. What is a way out of this, you know, conceptually? And it turns out lesbianism is one of those.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. I mean, I think it also helped that this was a time when, you know, the fans were, you know, I think webcomics were kind of ahead of the curve on this one. And I think it's because webcomic artists were much more engaged with their fan communities. And sometimes that is very terrible, and sometimes that's less terrible. But, you know, but I think you get a lot of, you know, you got a lot of people saying, I'm reading this female friendship as gay, and enough people said it that the author went back and looked at it and went, actually, now that you put it that way.
And it's like, I think that there, you know, after the first wave of people, I think there was a second wave of people who was like, oh, this is marketable. It's in the zeitgeist. It's the style.
Right.
You know, we'll go with it.
Right.
But I do, at least as far as I remember, the first people who were doing it were not people like that. They didn't care what was going on in the zeitgeist. It was more or less like, you know, they were people who wanted to write their stories, and they figured out that they wanted lesbians to be in their stories for reasons which are theirs.
Yes.
You know? I had been waiting for an excuse to talk about that for years, and having done so, I made the following noise. Okay.
Okay, final notes?
Final notes. There are a couple of things that I like. My favorite joke in the entire two books was the throwaway line about how the architect of the castle had the latrines empty out onto where the birds perched as a form of revenge.
Yes.
Despite it being like, bird violence.
There's
also, I should add a trigger warning for bird
violence.
Oh
yeah, bird violence.
Poor Carla the magpie
yes.
gets got.
Yeah, but then she's basically just a projection of Gemeral's personality. So they get Clara too.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that also outs Gemeral as the kind of person who, when their pet dies, you name the next pet name too, right. Which is questionable.
Right. But it also outs Gemeral as the sort of person who, can't process, who's like so bad at processing her own feelings that she has taken a part of her brain, put it into a talking bird so that she can like literally have conversations with herself. And that she prefers that to, just like hanging out with other people.
Right. Gemeral might be a little bit autistic. She might be a little bit of a Therian. She might have a system going on. You never, we didn't have these terms in 2002. And so that was something that I really enjoyed. And also I really liked, what was it? Clara?
Yeah.
The magpie.
Clara the magpie.
That was both a cool bit of characterization for Gemeral, also just, fun. I like a snarky animal.
Yes. Also, I do enjoy that, like, it comes up multiple times, is Gemeral Gemeral having this conversation with Clara and then having to remind herself, okay, but this is just me talking to myself. Like, this is actually really kind of solipsistic of me. I'm still going to do it, but I need to, be aware.
Who among us has not done this?
No, exactly. Like, again, this is... I don't know if it's intentional or not, but I think that Gemeral is very good, non-stereotypical. Like, she has some neurodivergent features, which I think are, feel really true to life, but are not necessarily the stereotypical ones.
One of the advantages of having one of your alters exist as a separate entity, it can fly. One of the disadvantages of having one of your alters exist as a separate entity, you might mistake it for a real person. Also, it can be squashed by an evil sorceress. Yes. On the other hand, I don't know what the fuck the dwarves were about.
Me neither, except that, like...
Didn't like that.
Yeah, I mean... They're really weird? I mean, points for making your dwarves really weird?
Yeah, but it felt like we were falling back into the swords and sorcery bit, and it's like, this is the savage tribe of, of like nonverbal, weirdos. And like, I don't like that you've, there's no race in this world, incidentally,
right.
But we do have species, and one of them are like weird hermaphroditic dwarves. And that's the word that
that's the word that she uses. Yeah, no, I agree. I think the entire section with the dwarves is another thing, I would cut.
It's really a shame that that's where the climactic battle happens.
Yeah.
Also, we could have had the climactic battle at several places. Probably we didn't need quite as many of them as we had. Also.
Right.
So,
like, I get the ghoul thing, but yeah, it was just they kept catching her. And then she'd escape, and then they'd catch her, and then she'd escape, and...
Yeah, I wish the dwarf thing hadn't happened.
I agree.
But that's the worst problem I have with the book, was the dwarf thing, and it only lasted for like a chapter, so...
Yeah, and I think that the first third of the first book and the last quarter of the second book could really be drastically pruned, and then you just have one, still fairly short, fairly snappy novel.
Agreed. But we don't get our special weird little guys.
No, we don't.
For people like doing the prudent thing.
Nope.
So,
and this is definitely one of our special weird little guys.
Yes.
Oh, I had a couple other notes. One, even though this, you could argue, I don't think that you could necessarily, even though you could argue that this is kind of a flaw in the like pacing, plotting structure of the book, but I like that, Tevi makes these friends in the mercenary guild, including like, and then the one of the cute girl asks her out, and Tevi freaks out and thinks that she's being set up to, be trapped again, shoves her away, and now they're not friends anymore. And that never gets resolved. That friendship never gets patched up.
Feels like real life to
me. Right,
yeah.
Exactly. And it's, on the one hand, it feels like a loose end, but it didn't feel like a loose end that actually needed to be tied up. Partly because, Tevi, part of what, both Tevi and Gemril are having to give up certain things to be together. And, Gemril, she's going to slow down her career, and she's, going to always have to deal with people looking down on her relationship. But Tevi is also going to always be a little bit separate from the mercenaries after this. Like, this relationship is going to be, it's going to put both of them into some social difficulty for the rest of their lives. And they still think it's worth it. And so I liked that, that you get several times of Tevi like integrating into a mercenary group, winning their respect, being well liked, and then something something alienates her from that, and she's never going to quite ever get to belong perfectly anywhere.
Yeah, agreed.
Because I think that also works for sort of now that she's out of the literal queer experience, she's still going to always live the sort of metaphorical queer experience.
And I was like, I know that, when that happened, I was like, I know this isn't going to be their relationship in the book, because the book is called The Exile and the Sorcerer. Clearly the relationship will be between the exile and the sorcerer. But, so it's going to either it's going to be a brief fling, or, this is just not going to work. And of course it doesn't work. But I think like, it's great. It demonstrates the stakes, the level of what's going on in Tevi's head, the stakes of it. And, that isn't something that a relatively new casual friendship should recover from necessarily.
Yeah.
Particularly when you can't like DM somebody later and ask what the fuck that was about.
Right. So. And it is an entirely realistic reaction to her experiences in, the first act.
Yep.
Like, obviously that is actually how somebody in that circumstance would react. The only other time a girl has come on to her, it was part of an elaborate trap to get her exiled from her, the only home she's ever known. Obviously, the second time a girl ever comes on to her, she's going to flip out.
Yeah. Well, this one was a lot of fun. Thank you for getting me to read it.
Yes, thank you, Leora, for continuing to tell me that I should get you to read it.
Thank you. No, you understand why I got bogged down in the first,
absolutely.
First quarter of the first book.
That's part of why I didn't recommend it to you, is I wasn't sure, you would stick with it long enough to be charmed. But Leora kept being like, it's got wizards versus lesbians.
Well, thank you. Good instincts, Leora. I appreciate that you having done that. All right, so we're about to. This was sort of a prelude to our series on dark academia. So we're staying in school for the next few episodes, and next time I can be absolutely certain of this because we've already recorded it. Next time we are going to talk about an education in malice,
Indeed.
Which is a vampire book.
Yeah.
Until then.
Bye.
Bye-bye.